Welcome to True Crime Cases in 2018. On a hot June afternoon, the suburban Bliss facade was broken in such a manner as to haunt the community in the upcoming years. At the heart of this catastrophe were the Alexander is 45, investment banker who has a track record of his commitment to work and his participation in the community, and his 43-year-old wife, Elizabeth, yoga instructor on the side, who is well known for her lively disposition and contagious laugh. They have been a mainstay of the neighborhood. For more than 10 years, they appear to be flawless. Many people next door are envious of marriage. Zoe, a widow, and her family resided with the Ileana. John, a 19-year-old college sophomore, the Ileana summer residence had relocated 5 years ago, and although they maintain more to themselves than most people were, typically popular with their neighbors, that none could have foreseen that these typical lives would come into contact in such a disastrous manner. That Henderson had always been motivated by desire originating from working-class parents, and he had fought his way up the rural Iowa social ladder by means of pure resolve and a nearly compulsive. By the time he was in his early 30s, he had positioned himself as a future star at a financial firm where his coworker valued his keen analytical skills. His clientele valued his straightforward approach. Elizabeth's method of money management, Sinclair, as she was formerly known, the path of marriage, was different. From the daughter of a professor at a university and an artist, she was raised in a family that cherished individuality and inventiveness. She attended the school to study modern dance. College student hoping to pursue a career in theater, but in her final year, she had a knee injury. Put those plans on hold, causing her to turn to coaching for yoga and wellness. When they met at a charity event in Alexander was already successful in 2003, but social graces were instantly deficient. Attracted to Elizabeth's energy and charisma, Elizabeth Alexander stood for steadiness and the assurance of a cozy existence that would enable her to follow her interests. They got married without worrying about money. After a year, at an extravagant ceremony that was the conversation inside their social circle, their marriage was joyful in its early years. Thus his career kept on blossom, and he was proud to supply, with the liveliness he perceived in Elizabeth, deserved Elizabeth's contribution via transforming oneself into the ideal corporate wife, throwing dinner parties and going to social gatherings that were vital to Alexander's network. She additionally started working as a part-time yoga teacher at a luxury studio, discovering contentment and assisting others in achieving inner harmony, tranquility. However, as the years passed, cracks started to emerge in their meticulously crafted life. Therefore, his working hours increased. His desire to succeed drove him to pursue larger transactions and customers. He was hardly ever residence before to 9 o'clock, and even when he was there in body, but his thoughts were frequently abroad, continuously monitoring his Elizabeth call for market updates or emails. Nearing her 40s, she discovered herself. Yoga courses are becoming more and more restless. The charitable groups that were formerly composed of, now that her days seemed empty, she started to doubt the decisions that had brought her to, wondering whether she had exchanged at this time. Her fantasies about a golden cage, the inability of the couple to conceive in spite of years of effort, created an additional layer of stress on their relationship. As a result of the 2019 summer, Henderson's marriage was a well-kept front for they still seemed to be in the outer world. Consequently, the golden couple kept on great at work and just closed a transaction. It made him eligible for a partnership. Elizabeth's yoga sessions were more well-liked. More pupils are drawn to her than before. Warmth and seeming tranquility, but behind, they were practically strangers behind closed doors. When they took place, the chats were perun and focused on timetables, social responsibilities. Physical contact had become uncommon, with every contact packed with unsaid grudges and unmet expectations, as well as neither Elizabeth nor Alexander were prepared to acknowledge how far they had come, even to themselves. It was simpler to preserve when it drifted apart. The delusion to do the actions of a joyful marriage, followed by facing the void that had developed between them, didn't. They are aware of this unrecognized gap in their partnership was going to become the cause of a catastrophe that would not only destroy their lives but the whole Riverside community. The next occupant of the home was Ileana Alexander Dorian. 2014, after Zoe's passing, John and his spouse, Dr. Luke, a renowned oncologist, has died of the exact illness that he had fought to leave all his life. Zoe will be raising their son John by herself. A quiet librarian named Zoe had at first found it difficult to adapt to life in the new neighborhood. To relocate from their St. Paul's humble home had been essential to get away from the recollections that haunting their former home in every way. However, the wealthy suburb seemed strange too. She turned to her books for comfort and, aiming for the garden that quickly turned. John, the neighborhood's envy, was 14 at the time of their initial relocation. Teenage introverts are more at ease with computers as opposed to people. Moving to a different school had been challenging, and he frequently found himself the bullies' victim who made fun of his used clothing in a calm manner. During this period, Alexander, John had been mentored by Henderson, providing him with a lawn mowing position, performing unusual tasks around the community. Over the following 5 years, John had developed into the uncomfortable teenager developed into a good-looking, the young man's innate intellect, ultimately discovering a way to express himself in his study in computer science at the university. In spite of his increasing assurance, John stayed committed to his. He was concerned about her loneliness, mother, and isolation, and made it a point to returning home on most weekends, despite his friends were organizing road trips or parties. It happened during one of these weekends, early June travels, that he initially met Elizabeth Henderson in a brand new. Zoe has always been appreciative of light for the generosity of the Alexander, especially Elizabeth's attempts to incorporate participation in local events. She frequently mentioned Elizabeth's kindness without realizing brewing complicated Lilec's feelings beneath her son's kind exterior. Acknowledges the spark that started the relationship between John and Elizabeth Henderson was as intense as it was unexpected. Occurred on a warm night in June at one of the Alexander is famously barbecued in the summer at. Court was typically held close to the grill, entertaining his co-workers with stories about Elizabeth feels his most recent financial coup, especially alone in the throng, had fled to the comparatively calm surroundings of the pool house to add more ice. John's bucket, who had been reluctant to, his mother opted to pull him to the celebration. That time to take cover from the sound, and compelled, he went into the pool house to mingle, unaware that it was occupied, and discovered Elizabeth is having trouble handling a big bag of ice. Their gazes locked, and in that moment, he moved to assist her once anything changed. As their hands brushed the ice, they stood frozen in place for a time. Of the ice, which stands in stark contrast to the. As the tension between them increased, it was Elizabeth. He spoke in a gruff voice to break the stillness. John, she thanked him as she normally does. Articulate started to stutter, and brief encounter's reaction established them, setting the scene for the next. Elizabeth and John discovered themselves creating justifications for it began in each other's presence. Elizabeth, very innocently, asked John for. John is offering to assist her with her laptop, assist with her garden. Every conversation was infused with a subcurrent of attraction that both of them attempted to ignore the fact that their first kiss occurred. John, almost a month after the cookout, had been assisting Elizabeth in getting ready for one of her park yoga sessions. As they completed, an unexpected summer storm began. They sought cover beneath a neighboring gazing breathlessly and giggling. The gazebo. Elizabeth, it was pouring rain all around them, glanced at John and had a wave of she had not felt desire in years. Before she changed her mind, from there, I leaned in and gave him a kiss. Their dispute swiftly got out of hand, and they were careless and motivated by a mix of Elizabeth's young ardor and John's. They gathered in a desperate attempt to feel alive once again. In isolated locations across the town, throughout the rear row of the neighborhood movie theater, in a secret, the public library's corner, and the majority of riskily in the Henderson residence. When Alexander departed, he was at work. The gap in their ages makes them want for more. Lost in the fury of their theft, there were times when Elizabeth felt refreshed, finding aspects of herself again. She, long lost John, in his opinion, was captivated by Elizabeth's encounter, their relationship's forbidden nature. However, as summer progressed, the stress of keeping their secret started to become apparent. Close calls increased in frequency. Their neighbor nearly caught them in it, except Ains' doubtful look. When Elizabeth's name was mentioned excessively in dialogue, the guilt also began to heavily on them both. John found it difficult to the awareness of his betrayal. A guy named Alexander had been nothing but. Elizabeth felt herself lying after being kind to him. Increasingly, to her spouse, each deceit, another fissure in the cornerstone of her marriage. Yet in spite of neither the dangers nor the guilt appeared to ability to stop the affair after being discovered, blind in a tornado of desire and need, to the terrible outcomes that was approaching on July 15, 2019. It was hot and muggy before daybreak, with the air laden with the possibility of an impending storm. On a Monday, Riverside woke up to life as its citizens got ready for one more week of work and daily schedule. For Thaddeus Henderson started off just like any other. He got up early one day, one of his flawlessly fitted suits, and headed to the workplace earlier. Elizabeth had even woken up from her slumber. Her thoughts was already racing when she woke up later with. Consequently, preparations for the next day had told her the previous evening that he would be working late for a very important customer meal that would cement his collaboration. For Elizabeth, this meant an agreement. Chance, she texted John about it. Her suggestion that he come made my heart race. John, who had been over in the afternoon, days of suffering over the affair, saw the communication as an opportunity to terminate. In person, he responded with a straightforward, "All right," deciding to end it before the circumstances deteriorated much further from. Yet, the day went by slowly for both of them. Elizabeth went through the motions with each of them. Of her regular yoga lesson in the morning, intense energy takes the place of tranquility that her pupils were unable to assist, but John discovered it during his summer job. Difficult to concentrate on the code lines on. His thoughts were continuously wandering on his screen. To Elizabeth's ideas during the discussion should arrive at 2:30 p.m. John headed out. Next door, surreptitiously looking around to make sure none of the nearby residents were observing Elizabeth swiftly usher him in. Her cheeks turned red from a combination of between the thrill and the fear. John was the one who shattered the quiet and began to declare that they had to converse, but Elizabeth, misinterpreting his motivation and motivated by, he was cut by his frantic need to be wanted. Leaving with an intense kiss in spite of his, John had some misgivings. Reacting, his determination waning in the what transpired in the face of Elizabeth's intensity. Then came a haze of abandoned clothing, tangled branches as they traveled there. The master bedroom, all ideas of the affair was temporarily ended, forgotten as they became engrossed in each other in the meantime across town. So, Henderson scowled when seated in his office. The figures on his computer screen for presentations from clients weren't adding up, and he was aware that he would need to conduct a substantial amount of his work. As his fury grew, he snapped, decided to return home, reassemble, and come back to the office later to complete prior to the 3:45 p.m. meal. So he saw a vehicle pull into the driveway. John placed his beaten-up Honda in a little distance down the street, but the idea, it probably doesn't help Zoe. He pondered while running his errands and unlocked. The home was silent at the front entrance so went in, but something didn't feel quite right. A half-empty wine glass rested on the coffee table that isn't typical for Elizabeth right now. Hour later, a muffled sound reached his ears. Frowning, he climbed from upstairs. The staircase, the sound intensifying as he went to the main bedroom, which is how observed that when opening the door, there would be. His marriage is indelibly etched in his memories. The woman he had been in love with for 15 years was with John in their bed, the 19-year-old man whom he had guided, trusted back then with fury, discomfort, so he threw his hands forward so, used to shaking and manipulating numbers, suddenly clenched into fists on business transactions. He seized John and yanked him away from the. Elizabeth screamed in bed, and SC rushed to keep the two males apart and hide oneself. However, Alexander, her efforts were in vain. John took the first blow right in the jaw, causing the younger guy to stagger. Adrenaline-fueled reverse pump. Fear resisted, and the two men struggled, sending framed after colliding with the dresser, pictures and trinkets strewn all over. Nobody noticed the floor amid the confusion. The weighty book and made of crystal that dropped. Nobody saw it from the top of the dresser. Till Alexander became blindly angry, seized it, and lowered it onto John's head with an unpleasant thump. Appeared to echo in the abrupt quiet. John collapsed on the ground after that, blood quickly accumulating around his. Elizabeth's silence was broken by her shriek. With the whole horror of what had simply happened struck them all in that moment outside as storm clouds began to gather. Meanwhile, far away, sirens screamed. Everyone's lives were altered. Irrevocably, the river's picturesque facade side was broken, and there was nothing, would never again be the same. An overwhelming number of police sirens broke the customary tranquility of the neighbors in the community looked out from curiosity mixing behind curtains with fear as police vehicles and the ambulance screamed to stop in front of the Henderson home. The responding cops were greeted by a gruesome scene that would haunt them years to enter. They discovered Henderson's hands were shocked by the shell. Blood-covered, perched on the verge of. Elizabeth was lying on the bed with his head in his hands. The room is crazy and hardly dressed. Had all the warning signs of a violent. Furniture was damaged by the scuffle. Glass and bloodstains on Eva Rossi, a hardwood floor detective, veteran of the law enforcement agencies. The site was taken up by the homicide unit. Getting medical care was her first priority. John's attentiveness as a paramedic. Rossi worked frantically to steady him. Started the painstaking piecing procedure. Together, the circumstances that had resulted in this. Alexander is still in a state of tragedy. Shock was placed under arrest without opposition. Elizabeth was on her own. Asked about their stories, which were broken apart and passionately depicted a lengthy, smoldering discord in the marriage that had. As word spread, violence broke out. A mob started to move around the area, to congregate at the police perimeter between. Zoe John was among them, and she passed out in sorrow upon learning about her son's serious state. She was promptly sent to the medical facility where John was battling to survive in the inquiry in the intensive care unit. Swiftly, forensics teams searched via the Henderson residence, gathering proof and taking the crystal book's images are now. A possible murder weapon was meticulously. Neighbors were tagged and bagged. Interviewed them and added background to the connections between the one neighbor between the Alexander and the Ileana. Remembered hearing elevated voices coming from the Henderson's home earlier in the afternoon, but had written it off as a TV playing very loudly, according to another, observing John arrive at the Henderson residence about 2:30 p.m., taking note of it because he felt strange considering Alexander's customary labor routine when the darkness descended and the gravity. Once the circumstance became evident, it was 9:47 p.m. when John was declared deceased. Having never recovered consciousness, Henderson was charged with, promoted to second degree from assault. In the days that followed, additional murders, details surfaced that left Elizabeth feeling guilty, and coming under close examination, acknowledged that her remark on the affair with John, while crying in the police station, gave a chronology of their connection and the circumstances that led to Alexander to that terrible afternoon. Counseled by his hurriedly hired lawyer, stayed quiet, but his co-workers, the image of a guy was painted by the firm, working long hours under extreme pressure, hours in search of a collaboration that had appeared to be out of reach, but had suspected how deep his marriage was, issues or the potential for violence, that the case against them had been released. Henderson Alexander was constructing, but Rossi was aware that in the public court, belief, there wouldn't be any obvious antagonists or heroes, but simply victims in this tale, each of the mysteries in their own unique manner, falsehoods that had at last surfaced in the most destructive way imaginable. But the storyline surprise was unexpected by everyone. Coming soon, and the twist that will startle everyone, including the Alexander. The Henderson trial got off to a quick start. 6 months after the incident, an autumn morning that had completely rocked Riverside. The county courthouse is a majestic structure of white columns and crimson brick was surrounded by reporters and interested observers within the tense situation were evident when the judge summoned the court. To direct Veronica, the prosecuting attorney, Talbot is renowned for having a keen mind and even sharper language presented the state's argument. She painted a picture in her opening remarks. Striking image of Henderson as a guy, angry and envious people who had viciously killed a young man in the Talbot's remarks in his peak were slow yet powerful, her eyes sweeping around the jury as she pledged to demonstrate Henderson's culpability is unfathomable. The defense lawyer for doubt retorted with his own story, which he depicted Alexander as a loyal spouse and support system of the neighborhood driven to the limit by the darkest type of treachery. Sterling implied that the passing was a tragedy, accident brought about by a dispute that had become unmanageable as the trial went on. A parade of witnesses took the forensic specialist's stand, testified on patterns of blood splatter. Considering the amount of force needed to result in John's, neighbors who suffered fatal injuries described the character and the day's events. Witnesses conversed with the individuals, John's and thus his reputations, although it was the evidence of Elizabeth Henderson that held the courtroom's attention for two. She spent exhausting days on the stand, exposing herself. The breakdown of her union with, the development of her connection with, John's voice faltered as she explained. Thus, the occasion had interrupted them, and the terror of witnessing a dispute takes place beneath the crucifix. Sterling attempted to paint her during the test as a disloyal spouse whose acts had caused her spouse to become temporarily insane. Elizabeth, however, refused to back down from her role in the catastrophe while maintaining that nothing justified John's death. John gave a succinct but strong yet still distraught, she said, considering her son's generosity and his aspirations. The future was abruptly interrupted by an act of violence in the face of her peaceful dignity. This unspeakable loss affected many people in the courtroom to tears. As the trial came to a close, everyone's eyes looked to Thaddeus Henderson in opposition to his. He decided to follow the lawyer's advice. His testimony served as a study in contrast appears regretful times with, alternating with bursts of rage that had caused John's demise. He said, the strain he had experienced at work, the increasing estrangement between his spouse, and the horror when learning of his wife's infidelity in the description of the altercation. Alexander asserted that he had never designed to seriously injure him, had just become unmanageable as the trial advanced. Professional witnesses from psychologists were called upon to give a glimpse into the thoughts of those. The Archo was a party to the unfortunate occurrences, indicated that Alexander's behavior may be seen through the prism of what intermittent is what psychologists refer to explosive disorder that is defined by violent, aggressive episodes out of proportion to the circumstances. Indicated that Thaddeus had a high-stress job, unspoken discontent in the marriage, the surprise of learning about his wife's infidelity as a key element in his aggressive outburst, but Dr. Cho acknowledged under cross-examination that, whereas these elements may help to explain Alexander's actions were not justified, she underlined that a lot of people deal with comparable pressures without using the protection against violence is known as expert in family and marriage therapy to provide testimony regarding the effects of infidelity on the mind. Friedman explained the deep feeling of loss of identity and treachery that a person could go through after finding. He compared the spouse's affair to a severe psychological distress that can evoking strong emotional reactions. The psychiatric evaluations that were provided throughout the trial provided a complicated image of human drive and conduct. They emphasized how a blend of individual background and social norms and current events may collide to bring forth a perfect storm of disaster. Following 7 extremely grueling weeks of testimony, presentation of evidence, and legal disputes in Alexander's destiny, Henderson was comforted by the Judge Blackwell sent the 12 men to the jury, and women should intentionally maintain a tight stillness, dropped over the courtroom following a brief break to take into account every aspect when evaluating. Blackwell came back to give her punishment, claiming the crime's brutal character was balanced, considering the absence of prior criminal history and the particular conditions of. She gave him an 18-year term in the case, in a state jail where there is a chance of parole after 12 years, as a result of which was confined in handcuffs with the entire weight of the tragic events appeared to befall them. There were no victories in this courtroom, only lives that have been permanently changed by a passionate moment and a brief moment of violence outside when the decision is being announced. Nevertheless, the audience's responses were not all the same. Some believed that justice had been done, but others claimed the punishment was excessively severe or overly forgiving. But everyone agreed on one thing: the circumstances that had transpired in Riverside would make a lasting impression, impact the neighborhood for many years to come.